The Smithscript Daggers are the only weapons in the Throwing Blade weapon category, and as you guys know, I have been going through every single one and ranking all the weapons inside of them. So for the sake of covering every single weapon, we're just gonna make a whole dedicated video just for the Smithscript Daggers, and honestly, I do think it's kind of worth it. Like, these weapons tend to be shit on by a lot of different players, myself included, but I actually did do a playthrough of this thing somewhat recently from start to finish, only using like the moveset, no Ashes of War at all, and it wasn't even that bad. I believe this weapon is a very solid B tier option in this game, and it is for a bunch of different reasons. Now, this is probably one of the lowest damaging weapons in the entire game. They also just do horrendous stance damage. Every single dagger does like 1 stance damage each, and with a charged heavy attack, it does 2 stance damage. So you're almost never going to be able to proc a stance break with a weapon like this. And also, if you did not know, you actually can get critical attacks with the Smithscript Daggers. They don't really get higher motion values with critical attacks like they can with regular daggers, but at least they can do them. And another downside is that it's a Smithscript weapon, therefore you cannot buff it outside of the Shriek of Sorrow Ash of War. So therefore things like Greases, Blood Flame Blade, Crag Blade, Electrify Armament, you actually can't pair these alongside with this weapon. So that's more potential damage that it's missing out on, and less build synergy. But the reason why I actually do find a lot of value in these weapons is because of the obvious reason that it's an easy to use projectile attack, which, as I always mention with projectile attacks, they can just cheese the game. You set at a safer distance, you don't have to aggro a lot of enemies at once, you don't really have to engage with enemies most of the time, and you can just keep picking them off this way. And with the Smithscript Daggers, they're not going to consume any FP, and they're going to have pretty fast movesets at that as well. Now, the reason why people still wouldn't really care to use them despite them just being free projectile options is because there are a lot of different projectile options in the game that are incredibly cheap and efficient. Things like Stormblade, Ice Spear, Beast Roar, Spectral Lance, or even with the spell side of things, Discus of Light, Glintstone Nail, Swift Glintstone Shard. Like, there's so many cheap projectile options that could just do way more damage than this, and that for the most part, there's almost no reason to use it. Like, even as a secondary option, it's not going to be that useful because you can just slap some projectile-based skills onto a dagger and also just get a pretty decent projectile. But the thing that still makes me want to use the Smithscript Daggers is the amount of different buffs that you actually can pair alongside with this thing. The fact that you can boost the damage with the multi-hit talismans is amazing. You can stack things like the Thorny Tear, the Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prosthesis, and you can get like over 50% damage pretty easily because the movesets are not only very fast, but you're going to be at a distance. So there's actually much more of a chance that you actually can get your entire moveset combo off because you don't really have to worry about dodging or interrupting your combo at all. So you can keep the uptimes of these buffs extremely well. And also, it's doing piercing damage, which, as I always mention, is the best damage type in the entire game because a lot of enemies are weaker to it. Things like dragons or anything that actually has an armor piece. Any single knight in the game, they're going to be weaker to this damage type, and any single enemy in the middle of an attack combo is just going to take bonus damage to pierce. And throwing on things like the Spear Talisman, you could just do even more damage. And with how easy it is to like bait enemies' attacks out and just stay at these further distances and just keep spamming your throwing daggers, the damage and DPS potential is actually going to be pretty respectable for how easy it is to use. But it doesn't just stop there. There are so many other different talismans that you can help to boost the damage. The Smithing Talisman, the Ritual Sword Talisman if you're at full health, the Avareach Talisman if you want to actually help mitigate the damage fall off, and also the Blue Dancer's Charm. This thing only weighs 1.5 units. So if you did want to pair this alongside some lighter types of armor, you're just going to get a fat damage boost there as well. Now, when it comes to building around the Smithscript Daggers, you are definitely limited to just a dexterity type of build because the other different types of elemental infusions and specifically things like a bleed infusion, it does not perform well at all. I feel like a lot of people would have tried to build this around a bleed infusion, thinking that it actually was going to do very well because you can hit multiple times and being able to proc bleed at a further distance might be really good. But no, it's just terrible with a bleed infusion because you're getting like so much less damage. Like easily a quarter of your damage is just gone by going into a bleed infusion, which sacrificing a quarter of your damage just to be able to proc bleed, which against bosses does roughly around 10% damage. It doesn't really seem like it's worth it unless you can proc bleed very quickly, which with the Smithscript Daggers, it does not do well at all. Like this thing on average with a bleed infusion is doing like roughly 30 to 40 bleed buildup, which is just terrible. It's going to take forever to proc bleed unless you're going to be using Ashes of War like Scattershot Throw. But if you wanted to go with a bleed build with Scattershot Throw, you're better off just using the Claws of Night because the Claws of Night just do more damage and more bleed buildup with this skill. So for me, definitively, bleed is just off the table. You could potentially go with a cold infusion because actually it still retains a B scaling in both intelligence and dexterity, which can be okay, and it is going to give you more frost buildup than it actually would be giving you bleed buildup. And with frost, you only really need to be able to proc it like once or twice in a boss fight because you just want to benefit off the debuff portion of the status effect. And you also can pair this alongside the Divine Beast Frost Dump skill, which conveniently enough also does scale off dexterity and intelligence. and you're going to get the most amount of damage with this skill off this particular build more so than any other build, whether it be pure intelligence or pure dexterity. And I think the skill of this weapon, being that it's like an AoE attack, can actually help complement the skill nicely. But I think the most optimal build for this is just going into a pure dexterity build with a keen infusion, as you do get an S scaling in dexterity. So not only can I actually get the highest amount of damage with this infusion, but you're also just going to leave it as pure piercing damage, and throwing on things like the spear talisman is just going to benefit you greatly. And with a dexterity build, you actually have lots of skill options as well, and it opens you up a lot more, which these skills do go further than the regular Smithscript Dagger attacks. But in my opinion, I think Scattershot Throw is just the best option for the throwing blades, as I just think it complements it perfectly. Now, Scattershot Throw and Piercing Throw are Ashes of War that you can equip only onto the Smithscript Dagger, and I do think that Scattershot Throw is the better of the two. Now, as I mentioned, the Claws of Night has a better version of this, as it can just get more damage and just offer you decent bleed build up, but I still think it's the best option for the Smithscript Daggers, and I feel like this actually complements the Smithscript Daggers better than it actually complements the Claws of Night. Because one problem with the Smithscript Daggers is that they have really small hitboxes, so going against like skinnier enemies like to move or dodge around a whole bunch, you're probably going to miss. And also when you're fighting these really aggressive enemies that force you to be at closer range, you're not going to really benefit as much with these weapons. And that's where a Scattershot Throw does come into play, because it's going to be able to hit those enemies like to move or dodge around, hit multiple enemies at once. It's going to be doing a lot more damage at these closer ranges, and also it's going to stagger enemies better too. When you fight these larger enemies like knights or omens that you otherwise couldn't be able to stagger with the regular throwing blade moveset, unless you do hit a headshot, which can be pretty possible if you do like a bunch of jumping attacks. But Scattershot Throw is going to do this way more consistently. You can keep spamming it, stun lock them, potentially probably hit a whole bunch of headshots too, because you're throwing out so many daggers at once. And it's going to be relatively cheap. Now, the reason why I say it complements the Smithscript Daggers better than it complements the Claws of Night is because this thing gets really bad damage fall off, to the point where it's not really worth using at these further distances, and you're better off just using the throwing blade moveset instead. So when you're at a safer spot, you just keep spamming the moveset, the light attacks, heavy attacks, and once they get closer, Scattershot Throw is going to be the best option. Now, when it comes to Piercing Throw, this is not too bad of a skill, as it is going to be like a really cheap sniping based option. The skill does basically just as much damage as 2 light attacks, but it does hit from like twice as far away, and it only consumes 8 FP. So it can be pretty useful to hit enemies at even further distances, but it still can be input read pretty easily. It's not going to be the fastest projectile, and the damage isn't really quite there. Like, to put it in comparison, it doesn't go as far as things like Beast Roar, but it does go further than things like Stormblade, and the damage is actually like in between both of those things. But it is such a niche skill that I would just rather just go with Scattershot Throw every single time. And I'll kind of stay away from like these like single target projectile based options, being that your weapon already does this for you. You could potentially pair this alongside the Shriek of Sorrow Ash of War, which is a weapon buff that actually does boost your damage the lower amount of health that you do have, which this unfortunately is the only way to actually further boost the damage with an Ash of War, as you can't get things like Crag Blade or Flaming Strike. But I would just rather have Scattershot Throw, as it's getting more coverage with your moveset is much more important in my opinion. Now, there actually has been a buff that was somewhat recent. I believe it was like patch 1.14, to where it did buff the heavy attacks. And I think that same update actually did boost the range of the Smithscript Dagger. Now, the heavy attack buff was specifically just for the uncharged heavy attacks, and it was an increase in speed. And the funny thing is, the speed of this heavy attack is actually faster than a light attack. So you actually can go into a heavy attack, light attack combo and keep chaining it back and forth this way. And it could potentially just do like more DPS than a straight R1 spamming, but it also can just do more stance damage too. Just doing this combo can help you do like roughly 50% more stance damage. Now, the optimal combo for DPS is by leading off with a heavy attack and using like an additional 3 more light attacks, then going back to the heavy and keep chaining it that way. Because unfortunately, the follow-up heavy attack is not that quick, whereas the follow-up light attacks are pretty fast, and one of them actually hits 3 times, which is going to help proc the multi-hit talismans even further. So basically, every single time that I use this weapon, I'm just leading off with a heavy attack and then chaining in the light attacks. Now, as I mentioned a bit earlier, one other benefit with the Smithscript Daggers is that you can hit a whole bunch of headshots, which is going to help you do more damage and stagger a bit better. And you can do that pretty consistently with jumping attacks. So if you're going to use this as a primary options, that's how I kind of would build around it. And as I mentioned, if you were going to use it as a secondary option, it could be pretty viable if you just didn't really want to use any FP. Otherwise, there are plenty of other skills that you could use that you're going to slap onto a lighter weapon and just leave in your back pocket. But it actually can perform pretty well as an offhand option. And the main reason being is that it actually can stop enemies from regenerating their poise in their stance, because roughly after around about 7 seconds, without hitting an enemy, they can start regenerating their poise. And a lot of the time in this game, you do want to play around a stance break, so it can be pretty frustrating when enemies go into these like very long combos, and the next thing you know, their stance meter is back to full again. So if you are using a weapon that's better off like one-handed, you could just have like a dagger in your left hand and just keep spamming it every now and then when enemies just get a bit further away from you, just to do a little bit of chip damage and just a little bit of stance damage. So that can be another use for them. Anyway, that's basically everything that I actually wanted to cover about the Smithscript Daggers today. So if you actually did want to build around it, hopefully you did learn something. Now, as for the next video, I probably am going to cover the hand-to-hand weapons. Just do a little versus battle between the Dane's Footwork and the Dryleaf Arts to see which one is actually better. So definitely do subscribe for that one, and also do follow me on Twitch because I'm live there every day doing a bunch of challenge runs. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.